Realm presents Lowlife. Episode 8.
You just had to involve me in your bullshit, Vicky shouted when Marlon removed the bandana from her mouth. Are you okay? Did they hurt you? Marlon knelt beside Vicky on the floor. He used his Leatherman to cut the rope binding her ankles. Did the psychopaths who tied me up in my own pool house cause any harm? Is that what you're asking? I'm asking if you're injured. Do you want me to take you to the hospital? No, I want you to go catch those assholes. I'm going to, Marlon said as he went to work on her wrists. How many were there? It was a big bearded motherfucker and a scrawny blonde girl with a shitty attitude. Pete and Delilah. Oh, that's nice. Redneck Bonnie and Clyde are friends of yours? I thought they were. How did they get in? They rang the doorbell. I figured it was you. I just opened the door and there they were. The girl stuck a big gun in my face. They already knew the boxes were in the pool house. I'm sorry, Bubbles, but I had to do what they said. You did the right thing, Vic. I'm glad you're okay. Marlon pulled the knot loose, freeing her hands. He sighed as he looked around the empty room. Vicky rubbed her wrists and got to her knees. I shouldn't have let you keep that shit here. How did they know I had it? Short version is that I thought I met Olivia Matheson tonight, and I told her where we were keeping the boxes. But she turned out to be a weregator who was sending that info back to Wilma Novak. That environmentalist you went to visit out in the swamp? She's up to something big. I've got to stop her. How are you going to do that? That question had been rattling around inside Marlon's head since he left the Shady Lane retirement home. He still didn't have a clue. What he did know was that Eduardo was dead, his best friend Sparky just went down with a heart attack, and his ex-wife had been hog-tied at gunpoint. Wilma was responsible for all of it. Or was some of this his fault? Why had he ever thought his involvement could lead to anything other than disaster? If he hadn't deluded himself into thinking he could play detective, he'd be sitting at the Chicky Hut drinking Mai Tais with Sparky and Eduardo right now. Maybe he should just pack it in. Wilma had what she wanted. At this point, she'd leave Marlon and Kari alone. But then Marlon thought about Olivia Matheson. That young woman was being held captive out in the swamp. He was the only one who knew where she was. Could he really live with knowing that he hadn't tried to save her? And what about allowing Wilma to do whatever the fuck she wanted with the fully functional weapon that was now in her possession? Brad, did you hear me? Vicky asked. What are you going to do? I'm going to drive out there and end this whole thing. Look, if I don't make it back, I want you to know I'm sorry. I really loved you. And I think I still do. I treated you like shit. You were always too good for me. We don't need to get into this now, Bubbles. I'm trying to be better, okay? I know that. But being better isn't anything if you don't be careful. Are you sure you know what you're doing? No, but I have to do something.
Kari pulled the lever on the paper towel dispenser, but nothing came out. She looked around the ladies' room. There were no reserves in sight, and it made her wonder when a woman had last been inside this VFW hall. Eventually, she settled for a wad of toilet paper. She turned to the grimy mirror and started wiping dried black and green crud from her face. Her efforts barely made a dent. She resigned herself to the fact that she wasn't getting all of the exploded weregator guts off her face in the sad sack bathroom. Kari didn't love Grandpa Frank's choice of venue, but they needed to get away from Shady Lane as quickly as possible. There would be questions about the weregator that massacred a half-dozen people during a bingo game and then exploded. They weren't questions Kari was prepared to answer. Before they took off, she'd made sure that Sparky was in good hands. Fortunately, the facility already had medical staff on site. Kari walked alongside the stretcher as the EMTs rolled Sparky to an ambulance.
Not my first heart attack, and not gonna be my last, he told her, smiling. Don't let Marlin do anything stupid.
They reached Kari's Gulf just as police cars roared into the entrance circle. Frank suggested they lay low at his local VFW. Frank had promised that no one at the hall would think twice about their appearance. Most grizzled old vets weren't exactly pearl clutchers. Turned out, the place was deserted. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marlin.
Vicky's okay, but those swamp bastards have the boxes. I'm heading to the outpost. Don't try and stop me.
Kari pocketed her phone and pushed on the bathroom door. She found her grandfather alone at the bar. He flailed his arms and called out her name, as if she wouldn't be able to locate him in the empty room. Kari was fascinated by this lively new side of Frank Carlisle, a.k.a. Agent Gusto, even if she knew that his dementia would soon return.
Can I get you a glass of vino?
He asked. He already had 2 waters and a nearly empty glass of red wine in front of him. No thanks, she said. I just heard from Marlin. Wilma got her hands on your files. She has both sets now, which means she can finish assembling the muckraker.
And you think this woman is evil enough to use a weapon like that?
That's what I'm confused about. We know Henry Matheson wanted to use it to drain the swamp and build condominiums, but I don't get what use Wilma would have for it. She's a radical environmentalist. She wouldn't want to further decimate the wetlands. What can you tell me about the muckraker? Do you know how it worked?
The Q-104 LUX,
Frank said.
It was developed early in the Vietnam War. The top dogs at the DoD tasked the eggheads with finding a way to disrupt the North Vietnamese food supply. They were looking for any advantage they could get over the People's Army. The plan was to dry up their rice fields. They created a device that could turn water molecules into air molecules.
Evaporation? Like a dehumidifier?
More like transmutation. It was able to change the chemical properties of matter without phase transitions, which meant that the process was almost instantaneous.
There's no scientific basis for that, Kari said. That's impossible.
Sweetie, even before Jim Channon and the first Earth Freaks showed up, your government was in cahoots with folks pretending to be wizards and witches. There's a long history of bootlicking mystics haunting the shadows of the ruling class. Almost all of it's bullshit, but every once in a while, something sticks. In this case, it came from a Romanian nuclear physicist who defected to the States. She was a brilliant scientist, but her passion was alchemy. She discovered a medieval formula for an alkahest. She combined that with nuclear-age science and found a way to adjust the binding energy of atoms. Simple atomic changes were suddenly feasible. The alkahest powered the muckraker.
It worked? How come I've never heard of this? Frank pointed both thumbs at himself.
You can thank your grandpa for that. Me and Betty got wind of the plan and destroyed the prototype before it ever made its way to the generals. It functioned, but it was volatile. Soldiers were badly hurt during trials. Some really bizarre outcomes. Once the machine was dismantled, we stole the plans, and we took care of the architects.
Took care of?
It's better I don't get into that. We should have destroyed the plans, too. We thought coding the files and divvying them up would be enough. Hell, no one came looking for them in over 40 years.
Kari reached for her water. The flimsy cardboard coaster stuck to the bottom of her glass. She pulled it off and stared at the wet ring left behind. Her mind started to race. This weapon, if it turns water into air, could it do the opposite too?
Air to water? That was another proposed use. The brass wanted the option to reverse it, to flood the battlegrounds. The machine could do both with the turn of a dial. Of course, more water was the last thing grunts pulling leeches off their ankles in the Central Highlands wanted.
But that sounds like something Wilma would want. Marlin told me she'd be happy if the whole state was a swamp. Would the weapon be able to do that?
I'd say so, yes.
Kari stood up. I've got to try and stop her. Frank grabbed her arm.
Hold on, Kari. You can't just rush out there and...
Marlin's already left. He's on his way.
Maybe he can stop them. He seemed like a capable guy.
He is, but he needs help. Kari looked at her watch. They'd been at the rendezvous for what felt like ages, waiting for Marlin's boat guy.
"Don't worry," Marlin said. "Deke's a little kooky, but if he says he'll be here, he'll be here."
It was close to midnight when Kari heard the sound of an engine. The roar grew louder until a rusty Ural motorcycle with a sidecar crested over the horizon. The bike's rider wore a full-body polar bear costume. A small man in a bright pink robe and an aviator helmet rode in the sidecar. The motorcycle shuddered to a stop in front of Kari and Marlin.
"Brad Marlin!"
The small man yelled as he climbed out of the sidecar. He removed his helmet, revealing a long blonde ponytail adorned with tiny orange flowers. He wore black studded roller skates. Kari had a hunch that there was nothing underneath his robe.
"You told me you'd be here at 11, Deke,"
Marlin said.
11 p.m. Deke the freak time, baby. I'm at least an hour early." "Well, thanks for helping me out. I appreciate it." "Anything for you, brother."
Deke turned to Kari.
"How do you know my good pal Marlin?"
"We hunt monsters together," Kari told him.
"I love that. You know, I am forever in debt to our boy here. Would you believe that I was on the path to joining the police force just a few years ago? But I flunked my exam pretty hard. Brad took me aside, looked me deep in the eyes, and told me, 'Fuck those guys, Deke. You just be yourself.' And he was right. I created a monster."
Marlin grimaced.
"So, tell me about your secret mission." "We're at war with gator people," Marlin said. "We need a quiet boat, maybe some underwater gear, snorkels, wetsuits, all that stuff. Weapons too, if you got 'em." "Oh, you're going thunderballing, huh? Wish I could come along, but I'm high as fuck right now and still waiting for the shrooms to kick in. I've been partying with some furries lately. Great crowd, Marlin. You gotta get in on it. We'll find you a swordfish costume. Get it? 'Cause of your name?"
Deke laughed for a full minute, then snapped back into focus.
"I got you on snorkels and wetsuits. But you know, I don't fuck with traditional firearms. I do have a single-shot spear gun. Frogman Tom asked me to hold on to it until the heat cooled down. It may have been involved in the drive-by popping of the mayor's inflatable Santa last Christmas. I've also got an absolutely gorgeous Bowie knife I'm willing to part with." "Thanks, Deke," Marlin said. "Let's see the boat."
They followed Deke down to his dockhouse, which had several airboats tied up inside. Deke told Kari that, by day, he ran a successful swamp tour business. He showed them a small two-person fan boat and said it was quieter than a lynx stalking field mice. He gave them a spiel about modified mufflers and multi-blade carbon propellers, which would get them plenty close without detection. Deke was highlighting a route through the swamp on an old map when a horn blast echoed through the darkness. Deke spun around and screamed at the polar bear sulking on the motorcycle.
"I'll be right with you, Snowball."
He turned back to Marlin with eyes like saucers.
"You got this, right? I gotta get back to this shindig." "Yeah, man, we're good. We'll bring her back without a scratch." "Hey, fuck it. Sink it if you need to. I owe you that much. Best of luck to you both. Deke the Freak, out."
Deke skated up the dock. Kari marveled that he wasn't even in the top 3 craziest things she'd seen today. And the night was young.
Deke wasn't kidding about the airboat. As long as they kept it under 10 miles per hour, it barely made a sound. Marlin guided the craft up a tree-choked tributary. He felt incredibly self-conscious about how his middle-aged body looked squeezed into someone else's wetsuit. He turned to Kari, whose face suggested a similar discomfort. "I'm sure Deke washed them," Marlin said. "What?" "The wetsuits. You look like you're wondering who wore that get-up last." "That's the farthest thing from my mind right now. But thanks for adding herpes to my list of worries." "No problem." Kari pointed at something in the distance. "Is that it?" Marlin squinted. He could make out a faint plume of gray smoke curling above the tree line. "Yep," Marlin said. "Gotta be coming from the top of that mud hive. That's where they're keeping the real Olivia. You know, according to the fake Olivia. My grandpa Frank said that if the Weregator version remembered being held captive there, that's where she is. I just hope they don't know we're coming. Marlin was counting on Wilma being too distracted with her new toy to consider that they might use the back door. It would be impossible to monitor the entire swamp. That was the extent of their plan. Sneak in the back, rescue Olivia, stop Wilma from using the weapon. Kari had pushed for them to come up with something more elaborate, but Marlin wanted to keep his options open. He steered the fan boat around a bend, and the first structures from Wilma's camp came into view. He killed the engine and reached for a pair of Deke's binoculars. The first thing he noticed was how deserted the outpost looked. When he and Sparky were out here 2 nights ago, the place was bustling. Tonight, the shacks and rope bridges appeared lifeless. The tiki torches were unlit. There were no gutter punks in sight. "It's so quiet," he said, handing the binoculars to Kari. "Hold on. I can see something behind the... What are you calling it?" she asked. "The mud hive." "What do you see?" "Take a look." Kari passed the binoculars back to Marlin. He saw a much larger airboat drifting on the far side of the mud hive. The passenger benches had been removed. It was almost like a floating trailer bed with a giant fan on one end. Wilma, Delilah, and Pete stood around some kind of metal cabinet in the center of the boat. It was nearly the same height as Pete. Toward the top of the device, it looked like there were 2 glass fish bowls. Marlin could make out a green liquid dripping from one sphere to the other. "I think I see the muckraker. It looks like an arcade machine. But where Donkey Kong should be, there's some kind of liquid transfer going on. I have a hunch we need to stop them before it finishes." "What about Olivia? She must still be in the hive." "They might have evacuated her. This place was full of people last time. We got to focus on stopping Wilma." "And if we fail and this whole place gets flooded? Olivia will die if we can't find her first." She had a point there. "Okay. I'll take on Wilma. You go look for Olivia." He pointed at a long rope bridge connecting the mud hive to an island of small trees. "You should be able to walk along there to get to the bridge. The mangroves will block their view." "And how are you going to get to their boat?" Marlin pulled a snorkel and fins from under his seat. "I'm going to swim." "You know how to use those?" "Yeah, sure. I've snorkeled before." "Where?" Kari looked unconvinced. "In my buddy's pool." "How old were you?" 8 or 9. "Jesus, Marlin, maybe I should do the swimming part." "What, the Yankee is going to teach the Floridian how to swim?" "Brad, I'm a marine biologist. I'm a PADI-certified diving instructor. I've spent countless hours under..." "Yeesh, are you just going to keep bragging about your swimming lessons, or are we doing this?" Kari smiled. "Sorry. Just keep an eye out for gators." Marlin raised the spear gun. "That's what this is for. You feel okay with the Bowie knife? Or do you need to get certified for that, too?"
It was slow going on foot for Kari. She had to keep climbing over fallen trees and trudging through knee-deep muck. Whenever she'd reach an area where she had a view of the swamp, she would try to locate Marlin's snorkel. He was making progress, but she could tell that he was struggling. At one point, she spotted him below a shack, clutching a stilt to catch his breath. Kari finally reached the rope bridge, where she got her first good look at the mud hive. The name Marlin had given it was certainly accurate. It was shaped like a beehive, a gigantic patchwork of wood and mud wrapped around an enormous ancient cypress. A wooden staircase spiraled around the roots. The structure began 20 feet above the water level, then stretched another 2 stories into the sky. Smoke spewed from a chimney at the top. She stepped onto the first wooden plank of the rope bridge. She could feel it buckling under her weight. Kari grabbed the rope railings on each side and took another step. A board cracked under her feet and splashed into the water. This was going to take a while.
Marlin spit out his mouthpiece and inhaled the night air, struggling not to make a sound. Snorkeling to Wilma's airboat had been an ordeal. It was his longest swim in decades. The sawgrass had torn up his wetsuit, and he must have swallowed at least a liter of swamp water. When he reached the boat, Marlin clung to the port side, his flippered feet treading water below. He lifted himself until he had a view of the boat's deck. Wilma's nylon folding chair strained under her weight as she leafed through documents that Marlin guessed were from her newly acquired Gusto files. Pete sat on a chair in front of the muckraker, fiddling with a dial. Delilah paced near the pilot seat. She was closest to Marlin and the only one who was clearly armed. Her .45 stuck out of the front of her Daisy Dukes. As Delilah turned away, Marlin took a deep breath and hoisted his tired body onto the boat, swinging his legs around so he lay flat on the deck. Amazed that no one had seen him, he hopped into a crouching attack position. His fins made a wet slapping sound. Pete was the first to notice.
"Behind you!"
he shouted at Delilah. She spun around as Marlin unstrapped his spear gun and aimed it at her head. "Reach for the sky," he shouted. Delilah pulled the .45 from her waistband and leveled it at him. Marlin and Delilah locked eyes, their guns trained on each other. Delilah craned her neck toward her mother. "What do I do, Mom?"
"Shoot him,"
Wilma said. Marlin snarled at Delilah. "You pull that trigger, I pull mine."
"He's bluffing,"
Wilma said.
"He's an idiot, not a killer."
"How do you know I'm not both?"
"Delilah, shoot him already,"
Wilma repeated. "Try me," Marlin said, pushing his diving mask up on his forehead. "I've got a real itchy trigger finger."
"That part's true," Wilma said. "This guy shot himself in the foot on his first day as a cop."
Pete chuckled to himself. "Shut up over there," Marlin said, "or I shoot you instead." "You shoot Pete, I shoot you," Delilah said. "That goes double for my mom." Fuck, Marlin thought. He wished he'd listened to Kari and come up with more of a plan. Wilma stood and took a step toward Marlin.
"This your first standoff? You're looking a little confused."
"No," Marlin said.
"Let me walk you through it. You're going to want to keep that gun trained on Delilah. Don't get too distracted by anything Pete and I are doing, okay? Let your guard down, Delilah shoots you between the eyes."
"Bullshit. I've got a spear gun aimed at your daughter. I still hold some cards." Wilma scratched her chin.
"I reckon that's right. Now, what is it that you want me to do?"
"I want you to disarm the weapon."
"Oh, it's not armed yet. It's still charging."
Marlin glanced at the muckraker. The green liquid had almost filled the lower glass bowl. "Then I'm going to need you to turn it off." Wilma smiled.
"You really think I came this far and you pointing a harpoon gun at my daughter is going to stop me?"
"Jesus, Mom," Delilah whispered. "I guess I shouldn't expect you to care about a human life," Marlin said. "Not after what you put Olivia Matheson through." Wilma clapped her hands together.
"Ooh, Detective Brad Marlin thinks he's figured it all out, huh?"
"I know enough. You used Olivia as a pawn. You tricked her into stealing the Moxie files from her father. Then you used those files to create a Gator Soldier duplicate of her that you sent to fetch the Gusto files."
"Well, let's be honest," Wilma said. "The term Gator Soldier is a stretch. That first attempt at making an Olivia from a gator didn't exactly work as advertised, did it? But we did a damn good job considering we only had half the directions."
"And the half you didn't have was the mind control portion, right? You were able to implant a primal need in her brain to steal Frank Carlisle's files, but you couldn't control her beyond that." Wilma looked to Pete.
"You believe this? He's not bad."
She turned back to Marlin.
"Yeah, the mind control turned that first gator Olivia's brain to mush. She was already falling apart when you killed her. Whatever you did with the body saved me the hassle of having to go clean up the mess."
"So who was the second weird gator?" The one you sent to follow Kari's car. Marlin nodded toward Pete. Was that you?
No, Pete said. A street kid. He volunteered.
Not about to risk experimenting on yourselves, huh? That's why you made another gator Olivia. But this time you skipped the mind control.
Correct,
Wilma said.
For round 2, we used some good old-fashioned manipulation.
You didn't tell her what she was. And you let her think she was the genuine article, escaping from the outpost of her own free will. But before that, you made sure she overheard that Brad Marlin was the one person who could stop you. So she sought me out at the Chickie Hut, I confided in her where the boxes were, and now you're sitting here with that thing ready to run. Wilma laughed.
Good Lord, I did not expect you to let that secret slip so quickly. I thought it'd be days before we got it out of you.
I'm a pretty trusting guy, Marlin shrugged. I nearly killed Henry Matheson because of you.
Well, that fucker's still a piece of shit. Trust me, it's best that the muckraker's in my hands. I'm about to do the Everglades some good.
Sure. Good for gators, good for fish. Not good for people.
Mr. Marlin, the people have had their chance, and they blew it. It's time to give Florida back to the swamp.
I'm not going to let you do that.
Oh, yeah? You figure out how you're going to stop the 3 of us with one lousy harpoon?
Kari breathed a sigh of relief as she took her final step off the rope bridge. She'd suffered a mild panic attack in the middle of the trip when 3 planks fell loose at once, but she powered through. Safely across the bridge, she steeled herself as she stepped through the opening into the mud hive. The interior was dark and cavernous. The roots of the giant cypress tree extended through the clay floor, merging to form a mighty trunk. Olivia had to be in here somewhere. Kari looked up at the tangle of growth and clay that passed for a ceiling. High above, she could make out the shape of a person, bound to the tree by an assortment of roots growing in and out of their flesh. She couldn't see the face, but the body belonged to a large man. Kari realized this meant that there could be a weregator nearby. "Hello?" a woman's voice called out. Kari turned. She saw a small figure curled in a ball on the other side of the chamber. Even in the dark, Kari recognized her red hair. "Olivia?" she asked. "Yes. Who are you?" "My name is Kari. I'm here to help."
Marlin's arm was starting to ache. Aiming the spear gun at Delilah took more strength than he'd expected. What little plan he had was failing. The muckraker made a buzzer noise, like the wrong answer on a game show. Wilma rubbed her hands together.
She's all charged up. Pete, you want to get her going? Just be careful you don't touch the bowls.
Pete stood up with a groan. Out of the corner of his eye, Marlin noticed the hemorrhoid pillow resting on the abandoned seat. "Whoa, where are you going, pal?" Marlin asked. "Nobody moves, okay? I'll shoot Delilah."
Oh, fuck off,
Wilma said. "Mama, listen to the man," Delilah said. "He could shoot me."
Delilah, honey, I hope he doesn't. But if you're really here for the cause, you'll stop whining and worrying about getting shot.
I support the cause.
Oh, really? You do? Remind me again what your first instinct was when Olivia came into our orbit. You wanted to kidnap her and run a ransom. You wanted money.
Money from her shitty capitalist father. We got operating costs. It'd be nice to buy some hot food every once in a while.
That's what I'm talking about. Your head ain't right. You're too damned materialistic.
What about Pete? Delilah asked. You let him keep his fucking SUV.
The truck is different. That's for work.
Plus, it's a hybrid, Pete chimed in. As Marlin listened to their bickering, he thought back to Saturday night when he and Kari moved the boxes. The weregator following them was driving an SUV, and when Kari ran over its tail, it would have left a bruise behind. Or a bruised behind. Hey, Pete, Marlin yelled. Keep meaning to ask about your hemorrhoids. That's what the pillow's for, right?
Shut up,
Pete said. That pillow help? I've got a nasty case myself.
As a matter of fact, it does.
Can I offer you a little advice? Something I told my good friend Eduardo when he was about to take his police exam?
What's that?
Pete said. You can be a freak, just don't lie about it. Marlin pivoted his back foot and charged at Pete. Gunshots rang in his ears, but he kept moving, balling his right hand into a fist. He jumped through the air and landed a punch on the base of the big man's neck. Pete exploded in a supernova of black ooze. Marlin landed hard on his side. He heard more gunshots. He braced for the worst, but the pain didn't come. She must have missed. He watched Delilah lower her pistol. Marlin aimed his weapon and fired. The spear whizzed past Delilah, sailing off into the swamp. He turned his head to find Wilma smiling.
You two should be proud of yourselves. That was the most pathetic gunfight I've ever seen.
Kari cut carefully at the ropes binding Olivia's wrists. I can't believe you're here. Olivia seemed to be in a daze. I remember a nursing home. It's all so fuzzy. Is everyone okay? Kari nodded, but she wasn't sure what to tell her. This was the real Olivia, not the rampaging monster she'd encountered earlier in the night. As Kari sliced through the final bit of rope binding, a moan of agony echoed overhead. The figure in the roots thrashed against the tree. What's happening up there? Kari asked. Olivia climbed shakily to her feet. It's okay. He won't get loose. Who is it? His name is Pete. He's a bad man. He's controlling the alligators. Alligators? More than one? Olivia crumpled to the floor. Kari dropped to her side. She must have been in this dark room for weeks. Her face and arms were covered in sores, scabs, and lesions. Kari shuddered to think of the experiments the poor girl had endured. Olivia steadied herself against the wall. We need to get out of here. Now.
Marlin rose to his feet. The muckraker sat humming in between him and the Novak women. Delilah dropped her gun to the deck. Marlin dropped his spear gun. They were both out of ammo. Now what? He asked.
Oh, I'm turning this thing on,
Wilma said, standing up.
We're getting wet.
Marlin took a step toward her. It might be 2 against 1, but you still have to get through me. Delilah smiled. 2 against 1, huh?
Poor Marlin,
Wilma said.
Can I give you one last piece of advice?
What's that? Marlin asked.
Always have a backup plan.
The water around the boat began to roil. They weren't alone. Massive alligator tails lashed the surface. Green claws grabbed at either side of the boat. Another set of claws reached for the bow. Fuck, Marlin muttered. 4 were-gators leapt onto the boat, surrounding Marlin. They looked bigger and meaner than the others he'd encountered. They threw their heads back and snarled in unison. Wilma cackled her machine gun laugh. The monsters advanced on Marlin. Nowhere to go, he pulled his snorkel mask over his face and dove into the swamp. In the dark of the water, Marlin rolled his body over and looked up through the murk. He saw the splash as one of the gators followed him into the water. It swam at him, tearing through the water with ease, snapping its huge jaws. The beast opened wide, ready to clamp down on Marlin's leg. Marlin spun and pounded his fist down on the back of its neck. The gator exploded into an underwater cloud of black. 1 down, Marlin thought to himself. The black mist parted. The other 3 gators were coming his way. It was a bad idea to try and fight on their turf, and he was nearly out of air. Marlin kicked his feet and swam for the fan boat's stern. He surfaced and grabbed onto the cage that housed the giant propeller. He pulled himself up hand over hand, like a monkey at the zoo. Wilma spotted him through the fan. "Ahoy," he said with a smile.
Gun it!
Wilma yelled to her daughter. Delilah hit the starter. The fan blade started spinning, the boat lurched forward, and Marlin was blasted with a gust of wind. He almost lost his grip on the cage, his fingers inches from the blades. As the boat picked up speed, Marlin felt his body lifting horizontally, his legs flapping behind him like a windsock. The sound of the fan was almost unbearable. The boat banked left, making a wide loop around the swamp. He saw the mud hive whiz by. Through the blur of the propeller, Marlin watched Wilma yelling at Delilah, but the engine was too loud. Delilah clearly couldn't hear her. Wilma mimed a steering wheel motion. She must have gotten her point across. The boat cut hard to the right, and Marlin lost his grip. He flew sideways through the air. A sharp pain shot through his spine as he crash-landed on the porch of a stilted shack. Groggy, he rose to his feet. He saw the airboat slow to a stop. Wilma smacked Delilah upside the head. Then he spotted the 3 gators. They swam toward him in a V formation. Marlin gulped.
When she heard the revving of the airboat's engine, Kari ran to the mud hive's entrance just in time to watch Marlin get tossed from the boat. Olivia limped over to her. She pointed at movement in the swamp water. "There, gators! They're heading right for your friend." Kari pulled the knife from her hip sheath. She took a step onto the rope bridge. A hand grabbed her shoulder. "There's too many of them," Olivia said. "I have to try. If we can get close, they have a weak spot on... There's a better way." Olivia hobbled back inside the chamber. As Kari followed, she looked up at the tree. Pete's body convulsed, straining against the roots that bound him. Kari put it together. If Pete was controlling the gators chasing Marlin, all they needed to do was kill Pete. Olivia pointed to a series of boards nailed to the trunk. "I don't think I can make it up there. Believe me, I wish I could." "I'll do it," Kari said.
Marlin hurled himself across the rope bridge as fast as his fins would take him. He had no idea where he was going. He just needed to stay away from the pack of were-gators. He looked back over his shoulder. The gators were climbing up the stilts of the shack he'd just left behind. Marlin made it to the next hut. He ran across the deck, only to discover there was nowhere else to run. Crap. Wilma's airboat pulled up alongside the shack. Delilah cut the engine.
You got a dead end there, Marlin,
Wilma yelled out. "Yeah, well, whatever," he called back, his reserve of snappy replies depleted.
I'm actually glad you get to see the muckraker in action. Too bad you forgot your umbrella.
"I don't own one," Marlin said for some reason. Wilma snickered to herself as she reached for the muckraker's dial.
Here we go.
She cranked the dial to the right. The machine shuddered to life. A deafening hum echoed through the valley. Marlin braced himself for... he didn't know what. He looked back across the bridge. The were-gators were making their way toward him. Marlin felt a splash of cool water on his face. He pulled the snorkel mask down over his eyes. Water pummeled his wetsuit. He stumbled back against the shack. It was like being in the center of a typhoon. A cloud burst from everywhere. The muckraker was pulling the moisture from the air. He rubbed his lenses. He'd lost sight of Wilma's airboat, but he could see the swamp was rising. The bridge was almost underwater now, and the gators were nearly across it. He needed to get to higher ground. He stepped onto the deck rail and grabbed hold of the roof.
Kari pulled herself up the makeshift ladder. She was face to face with Pete. It was a horrific sight. His eyes were white. His pupils rolled back in his head. Pencil-thin roots plunged into the flesh on his arms and face. They curled underneath his skin like bulging veins. Blood trickled from each entry point. Thicker roots held his body close to the tree. His body jerked and spasmed. "Hurry up," Olivia shouted up to her. "The swamp water is rising." Kari looked down to see water flooding into the mud hive. She gripped the ladder tightly with her left hand, unsheathing the knife with her right. She looked into Pete's all-white eyes. His chest heaved against his restraints. "Are we sure this is the only way?" Kari pleaded.
Marlin struggled up the sloped roof of the shack. The wetsuit was making traction impossible. He could barely see through the growing storm. A were-gator's claw slammed the edge of the roof. The creature climbed onto the shack. It snapped its jaws, catching Marlin's fin. He kicked at the beast, and the fin came off in its mouth. Marlin was on his back now. He crab-walked higher up the roof as the other two gators closed in. He was cornered.
Olivia stepped back from the door of the mud hive. "You've got to do it, Kari. They're going to kill your friend." "God damn it," Kari thought. She closed her eyes, bracing herself to take a man's life. This was too hard. She couldn't do it. Pete's hand broke free of its shackles, grabbing her by the collar. He yanked Kari from the ladder. She felt her legs swinging in the air. She looked up to watch his other hand break free. He reached for Kari's throat. His lips curled into a sneer as he rasped, "I will fucking kill." Kari swung her knife, slashing across Pete's neck. Blood spat across Kari's face as his grip released. She dropped to the flooded floor and landed with a splash.
All at once, the three were-gators exploded like blood blisters. Guts splattered Marlin's wetsuit. Stunned, he wiped a chunk of gator meat from his face. The water was still rising. There was almost no roof left that hadn't been swallowed by the swamp. He'd have to start swimming soon.
You're a tenacious motherfucker, Brad Marlin,
Wilma called. Delilah guided their airboat toward the roof. "I've heard that before," he yelled. "So what exactly is your plan here? Drowning the entire human race? Giving the swamp back to nature? That kind of thing?"
We don't deserve Florida. We fucked the whole place up. These poor plants and animals didn't do anything to deserve the destruction of their habitats.
Marlin looked to the sky. "If you keep this up, you're gonna end up with a lot of sad bunny rabbits out there."
Species evolve. They'll adapt with their surroundings. It's what they do. It's humans who are devolving. We're not equipped to survive this, and we don't deserve to.
So you'll live out the rest of your life on a boat while the rest of us drown?
I never said that. All human life needs to end. That includes my own.
Marlin looked at Delilah. "You're into this too?" "Yeah, of course," she said. Marlin detected some uncertainty in her voice. "Well, don't let me stop you. In fact, I'd be happy to help you along. Want me to hold your head underwater? I promise I won't let you up."
That's a mighty kind offer,
Wilma said, turning toward the muckraker.
but I've got something else in mind.
She held out her hands, poising them just above the glowing green fishbowl. "Mom, no!" Delilah shouted. Wilma touched her palms to the orb. The muckraker shuddered as a brilliant green ball of light grew in waves around her. Wilma let out an ear-piercing scream. Delilah backed away from her mother, a look of terror on her face. The flesh on Wilma's massive arms began to liquefy. Wilma turned to Marlin, her face an exaggerated smile as her jaw melted away. Her eyes swelled and burst like bloated balloons. Her flesh was next. It slid from her skeleton, a horrifying anatomy lesson pooling on the boat's deck. Her bones dissolved into the Wilma puddle. Her remains mixed with the storm water and oozed off the side of the airboat. She was gone. The muckraker settled back into its rhythm. "Fucking hell," Marlin said. He looked over at Delilah. "Are you up next?" "No," she said. I don't know what that was. She wasn't supposed to take it this far." Marlin was up to his knees in rising swamp. He heard voices in the distance. Squinting through the 360-degree rain, he was able to make out two figures on top of the sinking mud hive. "I don't know what to do," Delilah said. "How about you pick me up and we try and sort this out?"
Olivia Matheson, meet Brad Marlin, Kari said. Olivia gave a nervous wave. She was clearly in a state of shock. It had been hard to get her to climb the ladder inside the cypress, but they had no choice. They made it onto the roof, where they flagged Marlin down. He arrived in an airboat just as the water reached the top of the hive.
"Great to meet you, Olivia," Marlin said. "Let's get you out of here."
Kari was helping Olivia onto the boat when she felt her go stiff. I can't go with her," Olivia said, staring at Delilah.
"It's okay," Marlin said. "She's helping now."
We can't trust her." Delilah stepped forward. "I swear it's okay. I got carried away. My mother had this power over me. I was scared to go against her. You know what it's like to have a monster for a parent, don't you?" Olivia nodded and boarded the airboat. Kari followed. She spotted the muckraker. The machine hummed and shook. The liquid in the fishbowl bubbled. "How do we turn it off?" she asked. Delilah stepped in front of her. "You don't want to touch it. Let me." Kari watched as Delilah moved the dial back to a neutral position. The droning came to an abrupt end. The alchemical transmutation stopped dead. Gravity took hold, and the water collapsed on them like the last moments of a spring rain shower.
"Did we just say Florida?"
Marlin asked. "Not yet," Kari said. "We have to reverse the flooding. My grandfather said the machine can do that. Delilah, do you know how?" "No, I don't really understand how it works. Maybe turning the dial the other way, but..." The flat-bottomed boat rocked violently. Kari fell to the deck. She looked to her side. Olivia was down too. Marlin clung to the driver's seat. "What the hell was that?" Kari said. She climbed to her feet. The water was vibrating, building into a swell. A massive surge of muck and slime rose upward, a roiling column of turbid swamp looming high above the airboat. The tower twisted toward the boat. Kari recognized a giant mouth and two red eyes. The face was unmistakable. It was Wilma.
"Holy crap," Marlin said. "She's become the swamp."
This must have been one of those bizarre outcomes that Frank mentioned. Swamp Wilma let out a deep, echoing cackle. A murky appendage grew from the maelstrom. Delilah stepped toward the freak show. "Mom? What the fuck?" The muck arm swung at Delilah, smacking her hard and sending her flying into the water. The monster's eyes locked on Olivia. Kari saw a sneer crawl across its face. A gruesome black tongue licked its swamp chops. "Get down!" Kari yelled. Olivia, Marlin, and Kari hit the deck as the arm rounded back. The fist slammed the muckraker, but burst into fine mist as it passed through the weapon.
"What do we do?"
Marlin asked. Kari stood. "We need to reverse the weapon. That should stop her. That's gotta be why she's attacking it."
"I'm on it,"
Marlin said, scrambling to his feet.
"Wait, where'd she go?"
Swamp Wilma was nowhere to be seen. Marlin looked at the muckraker.
"Okay, so which way do I..."
An enormous wave tipped the airboat up on its side. The muckraker toppled and slid across the deck. Kari clung to the boat as she watched the weapon kerplunk into the swamp.
"There goes that plan,"
Marlin winced. The boat leveled off. Swamp Wilma rose up again. She was twice as large this time. Kari looked down at the water. "I'm going after it."
"After what?"
Marlin asked. "The muckraker." "You can't," Olivia said. "It's at the bottom of the pool. It's too deep." Marlin added,
"You'd also be, swimming inside Wilma."
Kari pulled her snorkel mask over her face. Can't I be the one to do something stupid just once?
If you have to ask.
Kari didn't wait to hear the rest of it. She dove head first into the swamp. It was dark, a blur of bubbles and vegetal gloom. She swept the water back along her body, kicking her legs as hard as she could. Kari thought back to her dive training. She knew she'd need to reserve enough oxygen to make it back to the surface. It seemed too far, too deep. She'd never make the return trip. But if she succeeded, she wouldn't need to. She fought through a savage riptide. Far below, she spotted the glowing green bowls on the muckraker. The device lay flat at the bottom of the lake bed. Kari reached out and grabbed the side of the machine. She pulled herself close, feeling around in the dark, searching for the dial. Then she heard an apocalyptic cackle explode through the water. Kari turned and found herself inches away from two glowing red eyes. Wilma's black maw opened wide enough to swallow her whole. Kari gasped in fear. Big mistake. Water rushed down her windpipe. Her hand brushed against the dial. She grabbed for it in desperation, cranking it hard to the left. Everything went black. Kari opened her eyes. As her vision returned, she could make out the starry sky. The moon was full. The night was beautiful. Marlin's face came into view. He was wearing a giant smile.
"She's alive!"
he hollered. Kari sat up slowly and looked around. She was on the muddy bottom of the basin. She saw Olivia Matheson sitting on the overturned airboat. Her legs were shaking, shivering, but she was in one piece. "You did it, Kari," she said. "Thank you." Kari turned and saw the muckraker lying on its side. There was still a soft hum emanating from the bowls. Kari coughed. She spat up mud. The taste in her mouth was disgusting.
"You swallowed a shit ton of swamp water, and I gave you CPR. I thought we'd lost you there."
"Is Wilma dead?" Kari asked.
"You evaporated her, along with most of the swamp. We should probably put some of it back. Leave it like we found it."
"Where's Delilah?" Marlin scratched his head.
"I don't know. Wilma knocked her overboard. Haven't seen her since."
Kari got to her feet and walked over to the muckraker. "We need my grandfather's help to decommission this thing. It needs to be destroyed. And what happened to the files?"
"Geez, Kari, can you take a minute and relax? We did it. The water probably destroyed them. Let's just take it easy."
"Okay," Kari said. Maybe Marlin was right. Relax. Everything was going to be fine. She sat back down to collect herself. She watched as Marlin poked at the mud, digging for something. She looked over at Olivia. The poor girl had really been through the ringer, but thanks to them, she was alive. "What am I going to say happened to me?" Olivia asked. "No one is going to believe any of this."
"Actually, Other you handled that already," Marlin said, looking up from his dig. "She gave a whole press conference."
"Oh, God, I remember that. Mostly. How'd it go over?"
"I didn't buy it, but I've got a pretty good bullshit detector."
"He does, actually," Kari said. "The night I met him, he knew right away that things weren't adding up."
"I did, didn't I? I should probably learn to trust my instincts."
Marlin pulled an object from the muck.
Here we go,"
he said, holding up a filthy mason jar.
"Wilma's moonshine. It's actually pretty good. Anyone want some?"
Olivia shook her head. Kari smiled. "If it'll wash out the taste of this swamp." Marlin tossed her the moonshine. She unscrewed the jar and took a swig. The autumn sun set over Arrowhead Day Camp, the purple glow of dusk illuminating decrepit log cabins. A mangy, battle-scarred chupacabra lay on its back in the middle of a sun-cracked camp road. This was the creature's happy place. It would rest here for another hour or so before heading out to hunt in the moonlight. The sucker stirred as it felt the pavement vibrate. It opened its eyes to see a large vehicle barreling up the road. The animal scrambled for the grass, barely avoiding a taste of fender. The black SUV continued up the lane, speeding past the cafeteria and pausing briefly at a fork in the road. Delilah Novak pressed her face to the driver's side window. She was trying to make out the faded, mildewed signs posted at the junction. She spun her wheel to the left, toward director's quarters. Up the hill, she spotted a large white house. In contrast to the other buildings on the property, this one appeared to have been recently renovated. Delilah pulled into the driveway and parked. She noticed a dark-haired woman lounging on a porch swing. The woman sat upright, stretching her arms out over her head. Delilah stepped down from the SUV. The woman walked to the edge of the porch. She was Asian, in her 40s, with long black hair. 2 large albino chupacabras guarded her feet. "You must be Miss Novak," the woman called out. "That's right. My name is Beatrice Lim. I understand you reached out to my employer, Henry Matheson." "Yeah, I've got the Gusto files. All of them. I'm looking to sell." Beatrice smiled. "Name your price."
You're listening to Lowlife, narrated by Nick Sullivan and Eleanor Cottle. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm. Listen away. Lowlife is written by Steve Marcarelli and Billy Lalor, produced by Marco Palmieri, and executive produced by Molly Barton. Audio produced by Amanda Rose Smith. Sound designed and editing by Kaylin West, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.